Welcome to this landmark webinar series on climate change. The aims of these are to provide you with an understanding about climate change and what's being predicted for the UK, how a changing climate might affect environmental hazards and risks, and inform you on how to advise your clients. So it's been 25 years since I first learned about climate change in my geography class, and over the years at university whilst training as an environmental hazards consultant, I learned about how climate change might impact different regions across the world and what hazards to expect. But it's only been in the past few years where we've been investigating how this might affect all hazards within the UK. Flood risk is the exception, where we've used climate change predictions to see how it might impact a new development, for instance, when that's being built, but we haven't looked at subsidence or heat stress, for instance. So focusing on this session today, I wanted to introduce you to Landmark and our climate change commitment. I wanted to go through what climate change is and how it will impact the UK. We'll also cover why climate change should be considered in property due diligence, and then at the end I wanted to go through how to give advice to your clients on climate change risks. So first of all, let's go through an introduction to Landmark. In January 2022, Landmark Information Group became the first property data business in the UK to support the Pledge to Net Zero initiative. This is something which I lead in, and we have been through a long process of calculating our Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions for 2019, 2020 and 2021, and currently processing all the data for 2022. But I wanted to share our results for our baseline level for 2019. We have always strived to reduce our emissions, but we've now got a bigger focus looking at a broader range of emissions, and we think it's hugely important to help us meet the UK target of net zero by 2050, and also to help reduce our impact on the planet. If you are unfamiliar with what net zero means, it's a commitment to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. This means that we need to reduce our emissions by 45% by 2030, working towards net zero by 2050. And how does this differ between net zero and carbon neutral? With carbon neutral, it means that a company's net contribution to reducing their emissions is zero, and this is achieved only by offsetting their carbon emissions. So rather than acting to reduce the emissions, a company will continue to emit the same level of carbon emissions, but just offsetting those as they go. So that's Landmark's commitment to tackling climate change, but what is climate change? Climate change refers to the long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. Before this term, we used something called global warming, which only referred to the Earth's atmosphere warming, and the term has changed since to reflect that not all areas will warm uniformly, and the world won't just become warmer, it will also affect our weather patterns. So global warming, as it's known, is caused by the greenhouse effect. This is the way in which heat from the sun is trapped close to the Earth's surface by greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide and methane. It is a natural process, and we need greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, otherwise the Earth's temperature would be -°C. The issue comes from the Industrial Revolution and our need at the time to emit greenhouse gases. The level of carbon dioxide now is such that it's beyond what would have been produced naturally, and this is ultimately what's causing our global temperature to rise, as you can see in this graph. We know that the UK has already warmed by 1°C since around the 1950s, and we can see this in observations from the Met Office land-based weather stations. There's lots of other ways we can observe this change. So we've seen an increase in temperature in coastal areas around the UK. We've seen less frost and snow. There's been longer and more frequent warm and hot spells, shorter and less frequent cold spells, and we're breaking many high temperature records. And the graph on the right hand side was produced by the Met Office after the heatwave in July 2022 and represents the top 10 hottest days on record. And you can see that 9 out of the 10 are since 1990, and the orange circle, which I've added, shows the recent record temperature set on the 19th of July 2022 at 40.2 degrees C. And as a result of climate change, I've added this graph here which shows the losses as a result of extreme events, and you can see that the losses are becoming more as the events become more frequent. So that graph was looking at global losses as a result of extreme events, but how will climate change impact the UK in the future? Before I look at the projections, I wanted to go through some terminology with you and look at what the projections are based on. RCPs stand for a representative concentration pathway, and these are emission scenarios adopted by the IPCC, which stands for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they describe alternative climate change pathways depending on the volume of greenhouse gas emissions. RCPs used typically include RCP 2.6, which is a very stringent pathway. It's compatible with the Paris Agreement and aims to limit global temperature rise by no more than 2 degrees C by 2050, and it's what everybody's working on at the moment to become net zero by 2050. RCP 4.5 describes an intermediate scenario where we're peaking emissions at around 2040 and then they start to decline. And then we have RCP 8.5, which is business as usual scenario where emissions continue to rise throughout the century. And when I introduce our report later on in the presentation, we've used a mid-range emission scenario of 4.5 to give a projected climate change risk for the property. When I'm going through how climate change might impact in the UK within this presentation, I'm going to be talking to you about the worst case scenario, so RCP 8.5. As we know, change is happening now. The level of climate change we will see depends on how quickly we cut our emissions. So the projections I'm going to go through are based on the worst case scenario, so that's an RCP of 8.5. So when we're comparing our climate in 1990, by 2070, the Met Office project that we're going to be having warmer and wetter winters. Now, what does that mean? So the winters are expected to be between 1 and 4.5 degrees C warmer, and winters are expected to be up to 30% wetter. We're also going to be having hotter and drier summers, and that means that we could expect temperatures of between 1 and 6 degrees C warmer, and summers will be up to 60% drier, and that depends on the region that you're in. So the southeast of England, for instance, is expected to be the driest. And we're also going to have more frequent and intense weather extremes, and that means that some of the hot summer days that we might experience could be between 4 and 7 degrees C warmer. And if you think about the damage that was caused in July 2022, when we had a high of 40.2 degrees C, imagine what that could be like if it was 43 degrees C. So these are things that we need to start adapting to. And as I've said, these are the worst case scenarios when I'm talking about an RCP of 8.5. So the temperatures could potentially be lower, but these are the ones I wanted to highlight that could potentially happen. So the next few slides that I want to go through is talking about why climate change should be considered in property due diligence. We've talked about how climate change might impact the UK, but what effect does this have on particular hazards? Frequent and intense rainfall events will cause an increase in flooding, and in particular with the intensity of rainfall that we're seeing already, we're already seeing increases in the amount of surface water flooding that we're getting. So this is something that we're going to have to adapt to. Changes in rainfall from periods of heavy rainfall in the winter to droughts in the summer may also increase subsidence in the parts of the UK because we're seeing large variations of moisture content. Increases in sea level rise and storms will then also result in greater erosion rates. So along the coastline, it's something that we'll need to think about more in terms of what the shoreline management plans are going to be for those particular areas, and if they're going to continue to be managed in the medium to long term. More extreme heat and frequent heat waves not only put people at risk, but will also cause structural damage to property and the potential for fires, as we saw in July and August 2022. But in the next few series of our webinars, I'm going to be talking more about those effects that climate change will have on those particular hazards. But it's important for your clients to understand what hazards might impact them and how they might become worse over the course of their time within the property. And property buyers are currently making decisions on the current risks that we're seeing, but they should also be looking at how those hazards and the risks will change in the future. But we also have to warn clients not just about the physical risks, but also transition risks. Now, transition risks are business or property related risks that follow societal and economic shifts towards a low carbon or climate friendly future. Heating and powering buildings currently makes up to 40% of the UK's total energy use. To limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C, the world must reach a net zero of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, and the government have set their own net zero strategy, which looks at a range of different industries, and one of those is property. We have the oldest housing stock in Europe, and therefore the government have introduced enhancements in the building regulations which require better ventilation within buildings and also better conservation for fuel and power. These include installing low carbon technology such as solar panels and heat pumps, and using materials in a more energy efficient way to keep the heat within the buildings and to cut our emissions as well. In addition, all new residential buildings, including homes, care homes, student accommodation and children's homes, must also be designed to reduce overheating, making sure that they're fit for future and also protecting vulnerable people. The future homes and building standards will be introduced in 2025, which will mean that all future homes are going to be net zero ready and will not need retrofitting. But we'll need to start retrofitting and doing refurbishments within the existing properties, and this will require obviously a large amount of investment. This is something property buyers will need to understand, and again, more on these transitional risks will be mentioned in the last of this webinar series. And lastly, what I just want to go through is how can you advise clients about climate change risks? There's now guidance out there that's been introduced to help lawyers understand how to advise their clients on climate change. The Chancery Lane project has introduced climate-related clauses for you to add for a variety of different situations. Marnie's clause is used on report on title and is used to highlight the risk of climate change and how it might impact the use intended for the property. It highlights that flood risk may become worse if the property is already within a flood risk area or located just outside a flood risk zone. It also highlights transition risks. Transition risks are property or business related risks as we move towards a low carbon future. A typical example for property would be energy performance certificates. The Law Society guidance on the impact of climate change on solicitors was published on April 19th, 2023. This guidance is separated into two parts. Part A focuses on reducing climate change impact on law firms and its clients, and Part B is all about identifying climate change risks and how these might impact on legal advice. One way to highlight to your clients about the risks is providing a climate change search, which Landmark can offer. This is something that we've been researching since 2019, and we've had lots of discussions with PSLs, property lawyers, and environmental lawyers. And after lots of feedback sessions, we decided that the report should be a separate report to the current environmental search that we provide. The reasons for this is because it offers solicitors and conveyancers the flexibility to add this to an existing search pack when they're required to do so. There will be certain property transactions where climate information is essential, and other transactions such as a short-term lease agreement where there will be little value added. A separate report allows your client the power to determine when it is appropriate to include climate change. It's also important to have this as a separate report for a more technical reason. Data depicting what may happen in the future is very different to data that we use to assess risk now. Current risk is based on what we already know, conditions we can measure and events that we have already measured. In terms of future risk, we cannot be sure what the future scenario will result in, whether we will meet the Paris Agreement or whether it will just be business as usual. So depending on what type of scenario that does occur in the future, we don't know whether or not the level of change will be the same as currently predicted. Therefore, we do not think that a 30-year climate change prediction should be viewed with the same level of certainty as the current risk assessment that is based on more comprehensive suite of data and with a Landmark or Argyle consultant analysis. The climate change report is available for both residential and commercial properties. The climate-related risks are exactly the same for both residential and commercial versions, but they have tailored advice. For example, we provide tailored EPC advice for commercial transactions, as future EPC standards can differ to residential. So when you're ordering one of these reports, just make sure that you're selecting the correct product. On page 2 of the report, you will find a helpful introduction to our climate change report. Here it introduces the risks we assess. We are looking at flooding, ground stability, heat stress, coastal erosion and energy performance. Property lawyers and conveyancers are not experts in environmental risk, and as the practice note specifies, it's not your job to comment on the risk in terms of what it means. So we cannot expect you to do this for climate change, which is a much more technical and uncertain risk to discuss. So on each hazard we have advice and recommendation, and this includes a background to why the risk could change and tailored advice for each particular risk. We also include transition risks from an energy performance perspective. This shows the current and potential energy rating and provides a cost to get an EPC rating up to C. The importance of this section is to highlight any financial costs associated with upgrading the EPC rating. And we also include stress testing. We're aware that this report may be used for a number of different scenarios and tolerances, and as such we provide a table looking at the short, medium and long-term timescales and different RCP projections. As I said before, climate change projections and understanding how it might impact a property is very complex, and we feel that this report provides the right level of information to understand the risk and solutions to find out more. We also feel that it's important to equip you with the knowledge you require to help advise your clients on climate change because it's a new subject. So we have our webinar series which seeks to highlight all the separate physical risks and transition risks. We also have videos on climate change on the Landmark Academy. We can also provide you with in-house training or bespoke webinars to your teams. So please feel free to contact us if you require any of those at all. Thank you for listening to the webinar today. If you have any questions at all regarding climate change, the report, any advice that you want to give to clients or about training, then please feel free to contact me on the email address provided.